Hi, I'm Diana. I did my presentation on port farms in Minnesota, and port farms come off of the idea of almshouses back in Europe that went back to the 12th century, funded then privately by the communities that they were built in and used for certain groups, such as soldiers. Maybe also could have been used as orphanages for children that were removed from the homes that they weren't safe in. The book uses impotent poor, that were people that were unable to support themselves, or uh, people that were unable to care for themselves for some reason. The communities generally feared that these people and thought that they would always have to be supported by the community, and that they would rely on them and be a liability, which in a lot of ways was scary, because they didn't have the means to care for them. The um, almshouse goes along with that Elizabethan um, law principle, because there's those 4 points of the public responsibility: um, caring for your sick and poor at a local level, um, denying relief to anyone capable, and forcing those that are capable to work. So in our country, in the 1600s, there's still a need to assist those that were impoverished. So and scary enough, some were being sold to the lowest bidder if they didn't have anywhere to go, so they were being sold into slavery. Um, Communities considered almshouses an economical way for the community to help those in need. We heard that in a presentation earlier this semester, or right away in this semester. Almshouses, um, the conditions were deplorable in most of them. So you take the worst way to live and double that. I don't know how anybody would want to possibly be able to survive in that. And if you think about how horrible the conditions could be, and then think that was better than where they came from, a lot of people just chose to starve to death because they didn't want to go to these places. The almshouses would eventually evolve into modern prisons. And in an almshouse, you could find people from ages 6 months all the way up to elderly people, and of all kinds of afflictions. In Minnesota, an almshouse was turned into what we called a poor farm. That was our version of an almshouse. It Because we have had so much land, and farming was such an industry, they used land and turned it into farms to get, number one, for quite a few reasons. It was a way to take the poor out of the cities and communities and put them out of sight in the country, and give them something to do, help run. They were expected to help run the farm if they could, and it was a virtue in hard work that they were going to teach them. And the land was considered an investment for the counties who bought them. So uh, when they bought these farms, and built the houses, they were basic structures. In 1854, Ramsey County bought 282 acres. Washington County followed in 1858. So they were the first two. In 1864, poor laws were established, And if you were destitute, you were expected to go to the farm. And that is, when they say over the hill, it's part of that whole idea of going over the hill to the farm. And by 1873, 20 counties in Minnesota had poor farms. So the people that were there, these basic structures, they had a table, 2 chairs, 2 towels, a pail, a small mirror, a broom, and a dipper to help get them started in these houses, in these farmhouses, which is really nothing. And imagine going there, and that's better. Again, that's better than where you came from. And these people are sick, they're mentally ill, they're poor, they're starving, they're children that had come from the East Coast because they have no families, they have nothing. They classified these people as insane, idiots, imbeciles, epileptics, sick, or disabled. The men matched the women 3 to 1, and that was cause for a lot of illegitimate births. And some of these farms were accused of being baby farms. They were owned eventually by churches and religious groups, and the babies that were born there were sold for roughly, some of them depended on which ones, but sometimes $300 or so. And everyone wanted to go there, and I can see why. They were run by caretakers, and they were generally the lowest bidder. They weren't the most qualified or empathetic of the needs of the residents. And the buildings were not intended to be comfortable, like I said, so the heat was bad, the pipes were bad, the living conditions were bad. If you had a 16 by 16 room, you could find maybe a man and his wife. You could find an 80-some-year-old woman. This is one room that was reported, man and a wife, an 84-year-old woman that was infirm, and a 14-year-old girl that was mute and helpless, all sleeping in the same room. So you have buildings that are not intended to be comfortable because they wanted them to suffer for being poor. All ages and all afflictions lived with people of both sexes in one residence. So it doesn't sound like a thing you would want to be a part of. Poor farms also housed a lot of sick people, and in some instances were the beginning of teaching hospitals. There was no visitors, so if someone was sick, they felt they had free reign. So what changed? Poor farmers found to be able to make money for some counties if they were supervised correctly. The people on those farms could thrive if they were given the right care. The legislature corrected laws to protect children living in poor farms, which changed the average age, and eventually it was an average age of 60. And the trend began to create the state's first care facilities for the aged. The legislature also created overseers, and Reverend Hastings H. Hart was one of the first to go and investigate these farms. And one of the things he found was that kids didn't belong in these poor farms, which is one of the reasons that the legislature corrected the laws to protect children living there. He also found that counties were not regulating the costs for the farms. So some were really, really nice and others were horrible, and that the farms were too big, and these small amounts of people that were able to care for them, because of most of the people on the farms were ill and could not help, and the few that could, they're older people, so there's very few people that could help with these 200+ acre farms. they were letting these farms go to disarray, and it was not, it just wasn't feasible to take care of them. And they found out that if they were going to continue, they would need better buildings. And if they were going to continue as care facilities, they did build a lot of better buildings with better supplies. And because time was moving on, they had better capabilities to do that. And they did away with a lot of the caretakers because a lot of them were criminals that were misusing their station, I guess is a good way to put it. One of the reasons that the poor farms were actually put into place is because President Pierce put social welfare on the states, and that made it necessary for each state to find their own way to take care of people. And they thought this was the most economical way to do it. In 1935, the Social Security Act moved people out of the poor farms as well, because if you wanted to receive your Social Security, you weren't able to be cared for by another agency. So people moved out on their own so that they could receive their pension. That's what they called it, their pension. That's this slide now. So as pensions were created, people were given that money and they were allowed to live on their own. So the able-bodied moved out of the poor farms. Social work began a steady flow of people coming to tour each farm on a more regular basis, forcing conditions of the farms to improve, which was fantastic. Caretakers were forced to improve their services, and that lowest bid option was phased out. The Crispus Attucks home is the only almshouse created by and for Minnesota African American communities in Minnesota by these two people in this picture. It's Reverend and Mrs. King. They came from the East Coast to scout out the area and came back to build a home for the African American community. Built or opened in 1906 on Acker Street in St. Paul, if anybody knows where Acker Street is, to care for the diseased and segregated community. Segregation was illegal, but they weren't following that. So in 1910, thanks to a very wealthy benefactor that stuck with them through their entire 50 years, they moved out to a farm down south in southern Dakota County. They were never given the deed to that property though, so it was always an investment by that wealthy man. One of the reasons they were successful, they had very strict rules for their residents. They were all to get up at a certain time. They had bathrooms at a certain time. The girls learned manners and things during the day, and the boys went to a barn and made paintbrushes. So everybody had a job. My method or process, of course, just like everyone else, I did my searching online. Thankfully, the Minnesota Historical Society has great resources. I found a fantastic book called More Than a Roof. It's right there. If anybody is interested in this topic, this one's probably the only book ever written about Minnesota poor farms, but pretty interesting. Ethel McClure. It's like a first edition from the Minnesota Historical Society. These pictures in my presentation are all from her book, and this this picture here is from the Ramsey County Poor Farm, and that's on White Bear Avenue. The building's on White Bear Avenue in Lexington still. So my process, tons of reading, because each county has their own documentation. Summary of my findings: the Poor Farm thought to be an ethical method of hiding the impoverished from society. Maybe then, but probably not now. The residents were thought to be given a place to live and taught the importance of working for their living. Yeah, unfortunately, most residents were beyond the ability to work at much on the farms. They were sick, older, not necessarily able to comprehend the jobs that needed to be done. In many cases, the supervisors of the farms did all the work, and what little the farm produced was used by the residents, which did cut back on food prices, but they also didn't receive enough money from the government, the local governments, to feed them. So the farms ended up costing the counties thousands of dollars each year. Social work values: service, the roof for the impoverished. Social justice: the residents generally were not forced to be there, but they were expected to be there. Dignity and worth of a person, a home for a person in hard times. The intentions, I guess, could have been interpreted to be good. Importance of the human relationship, not putting the impoverished in asylums, which would have been, I guess, in a lot of cases seen as worse. Integrity, I think it's questionable, but maybe still there. Incompetence depended on the county and the caretakers of the farms in question, because a lot of them were criminals. Application of course concepts: social work for social justice principles. Human dignity, definitely they tried. Community and the common good. They thought they were doing what was good for the community, and they thought they were providing for the people that were in need. The picture below is a poor farm in Minnesota, and it doesn't look terrible. I mean, if you were impoverished and you had nowhere to go and no family and no people, I don't know. Rights and responsibilities. So they thought they were teaching people the responsibilities they needed. Priorities for the poor and vulnerable. They were helping the poor and vulnerable. Dignity of work and the rights of workers. They were trying to teach them that. Solidarity, that again. And governance and the principle of subsidiarity. Run by the government. So, course concepts. I went with American social values based on the Judeo-Christian charity values. Obviously, they're providing for others. Protestant work ethic. They expected them to work for what they were given. Social Darwinism. I went with that because I think they were sending people out of the city because the strong got stronger and the weak were sent away to be weaker. And the American ideal, again, the strong got to stay in the city and be the American ideal, and they sent the isms away, so they didn't have to deal with them. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you. If you have any questions, let me know.